Namaskar and welcome to the Indology podcast. In this episode, I am going to discuss what happens when a prime minister dies. Now, many of you will guess that I'm probably speaking about the murder of Prime Minister Shastri. But in this episode, I am not going to talk about who did it, how it happened, or the many theories associated with it. I am going to talk about what happens in the corridors of power, in the halls of politics, behind secret curtains, what happens when a prime minister dies. To relive that night, I am going to refer to a source written by a Lutyens elite, a person who would go on to become a very influential person in Lutyens Delhi, a person who would be a part of the very close-knit circle of Indira Gandhi. In many ways, this was a very eventful night for India, not just because a prime minister had been killed, but also because the association of these people with Indira Gandhi, because this was the night when the association between Indira Gandhi and the communists was cemented. And that led to a lot of disaster for India because Indira completely handed over the education department to the communists. And what came out of it is what we are suffering through today. The most prominent being the Jawaharlal Nehru University, or JNU. We're going to talk about all this and more in this episode. And the book I will be reading you the excerpt from is called All These Years. It is written by our main character, Raj Thapar. Raj Thapar is the author, and the other main character is a husband, Ramesh Thapar, who were part of a small group of leftist intellectuals who initially were critical of Gandhi and Nehru, but after Nehru's death, they sided with Indira Gandhi in her power struggle against Prime Minister Shastri and thereon. How did this association start? There is a peculiar story about that. When Indira Gandhi was asked to vacate the official residence, the Teen Murti Bhavan, after Nehru's death, because the Teen Murti Bhavan used to be the residence of the Prime Minister. But after Nehru's death, Indira didn't want to vacate it. Indira wanted to hold on that property. So the Thapars helped her develop a plan to retain it permanently. They talked to different industrialists into donating money to establish a Nehru Memorial Fund, thereby converting the Teen Murti Bhavan into a Nehru Memorial, thus ensuring that the property stays in the hands of Indira Gandhi. This fund also led to the establishment of JNU, and Ramesh Thapar, our main character that I just mentioned, promptly secured a job for his sister at JNU. What was the name of the sister? Romila. Yup, that one. Indira Gandhi remained grateful to the Thapars for their support during the power struggle, which included a whole lot of criticizing her rivals like Shastri and Desai. In return, she offered them chairmanships of government bodies like Bal Bhavan and ITDC, but their performance was, to put it generously, mediocre. This book also is a great insight into the mind of the Latyan elites and how less their knowledge of the Indian society and culture is. For example, despite living in Mumbai for many, many years, the author had no knowledge of any Marathi or Gujarati words, or any of the local art forms, music, or anything else associated with the region. This biography also showcases her lack of intellectual honesty, but we won't get much into all of that today, because today we'll focus on the night that a prime minister was murdered. And Raj Thapar and her husband Ramesh were in the thick of the action, and this is perhaps as close to being a fly on the wall of the corridors of power as we'll get on that night. Now, the name Thapar must be very common to all of you. And as you must have guessed, yes, these people are related to Karan Thapar and Romila Thapar and the other Thapars. I'll give you a little profile of Ramesh Thapar from the Wikipedia page. He was born in Lahore to a Punjabi trading family. His father, Dayaram Thapar, was an Indian Army medical officer. He was the brother of Romila Thapar. General Prannath Thapar, the chief of army staff, was his paternal uncle, his father's brother. This was the same general who was in charge when India lost to China in 1962. The journalist Karan Thapar is his paternal first cousin. Ramesh Thapar was also related distantly to the family of Prime Minister Nehru. The Thapar family acquired wealth by making their fortune in trade during World War I as commission agents for the colonial British Indian Army. Like everybody else who was rich at that time, they also made their money thanks to the British, thanks to the generosity showered on them by the British. by essentially being brown sepoys. Ramesh Thapar was sent to England for his education. Fabian socialism, which was fashionable in the universities of England in those years between the two world wars, had a deep impact on Thapar at a young age. Starting as a socialist, Thapar developed into a Marxist over the years and remained a member of the Communist Party of India until his death. These are the people who are the main characters in our story today. And I'll start reading you the excerpt, beginning from the night that Prime Minister Shastri died. The author writes, Shastri had been in Tashkent, conducting talks with Pakistan under the Soviet umbrella, and a joint statement was issued, which we hadn't yet seen in the newspapers. Krishna Menon, who kept regular contact with Ramesh, rang at about 7 that same evening, asking Ramesh to go over at once. That was not a problem. He lived close by, just opposite Teen Murti House, in a house which he refused to vacate right until the bitter end of his life, despite all the regulations that had to be contravened to keep him there. It was winter, January 1966. Krishna was pacing up and down his room, muttering incoherently. "Have you seen the statement?" he asked Ramesh. Of course, there was no way Ramesh could have seen it, since it hadn't been issued to the public. "It's a betrayal," he said. "We can't let it go like that." He indicated that Radhakrishnan, our philosopher-president who had shown some unusual desire for power recently, was also disturbed and might be persuaded to act. "What should we do?" he said. "Why don't you ask your lady friend, that chit of a girl, and find out what she thinks?" Side note, when Krishna Menon says that chit of a girl, he is referring to Indira Gandhi. The author continues, Just then the telephone rang and Krishna indicated that Ramesh take it. It was one of the news agencies asking Krishna to check the statement they were putting out in his name, his views on the Tashkent Accord, and Ramesh was aghast as he listened to something absolutely contrary to what Krishna had just been telling him. "But this is absurd," he said, after putting down the receiver. "You have praised the accord and yet you feel like this." "That's for public consumption," said Krishna. You go and find out from Indira." Ramesh did just that, but before they could get on with the discussion, Krishna arrived armed with walking stick, flung the statement on the table in front, and with exaggerated concern asked Indira what she was going to do about it. She was impassive, calm. She reread the statement and suggested that they all wait until Shastri's return. There may be a secret understanding behind the clauses. Only he can enlighten us, she said. Krishna's face dropped to his bony knees. He had no comeback. That chit of a girl had shown more statesmanship than him, which he was far too intelligent not to recognize, but which made him even more churlish. Ramesh came home, but the night was only beginning. We were awoken by the telephone at about 3 in the morning. It was Krishna again. "Shastri is dead," he said. "Come over at once." A command. As Ramesh was just gathering himself together, the telephone rang again. This time it was Session, ringing from Indira's, with the same news and the identical command. The visit to Krishna was simple. He was visibly excited, pacing up and down his bare room, dressed in woolen combinations. You could almost see his mind ticking away with the possibilities that had suddenly presented themselves. A change of leadership, perhaps. There was a boyish spring to his step. And then he suddenly stopped to face Ramesh. "Who do you think I should go and call on?" he asked, his eyes shining in his dark face. Ramesh took barely a second to reply. "Mrs. Shastri, I think," he said. Crestfallen, somewhat ashamed of his excessive eagerness, he mumbled, Yes, of course, but what then?" Ramesh returned, threw himself on the bed, wondering whether he should go to Indira's or not. Fortunately, there was no time for further cogitation, because Session was on the phone again, this time with great urgency, telling Ramesh that Indira had fallen asleep with her head on the table in front, waiting for him. So off he went at great speed. She was very tired but livened up as she began to describe the events of the previous 2 hours since the news of Shastri's heart failure, which was a story in itself. L.K. Jha, Shastri's secretary, a man of substantial administrative power and experience, had rung from Tashkent to inform the president, but the operator there was having none of it. The conversation went something like this. "I must speak to the president immediately." "He's asleep." But this is urgent. I am L.K. Jha speaking from Tashkent." "Who?" was the reply. "Never heard of him." I'm the secretary to the Prime Minister who has just had a heart attack and died. I must convey this to the president." There was a second's lull in the conversation, after which the operator, thinking L.K. must be a madman, put down the receiver. He tried army headquarters. No response. Exasperated, L.K. Jha finally decided it was a hopeless case and rang his wife to do the needful. Gulzari Lal Nanda, being the senior-most member of the cabinet, was acting as Prime Minister in Shastri's absence. He was a tall, angular, abstemious, God-fearing Gandhian of the old type, a Labour leader in earlier times, but the news of Shastri's death suddenly transported him, in one leap, out of all those much advertised characteristics, straight into an inflated balloon of ambition. He hurriedly dispatched his car and driver to pick up his astrologer, Haveli Ram, who listed the do's and the don'ts, like which way he should face when being sworn in, or which chair he should hold on to on his first entry into the parliament as full-fledged Prime Minister. And what else we will never know. Then he proceeded to Rashtrapati Bhavan, shivering somewhat in his dhoti on that icy January night. Indira and a few others were already assembled, and Nanda, by now fully transformed into his Walter Mitty role, overcome by the vistas opening out to him yet again, was so feverishly excited that he was frequently to disappear into the loo during those swearing-in rituals. It must have been like an elaborate film set, Rashtrapati Bhavan, with all its inherited trappings, the liveried attendants complete with red and gold braid, the dhoti-clad president facing the dhoti-clad Prime Minister, amidst the extravagance of that imperial setting. When the gathering dispersed, and they were all descending the regal stairs, they suddenly could not sight the willowy figure in white. It seemed to have vanished into the folds of Rashtrapati Bhavan, until someone remembered and extricated Nanda from yet another of his trips to the loo. All this was described by Indira, half sleepy, half puckish. But finally, she came down to the gut question. What should she do in this situation? What did Ramesh think? Apparently, the politicians close to her had suggested that she make a bid for power. It was abundantly clear that Nanda was unacceptable. And right now, just after the Indo-Pak war, her image was larger than life. And it might be quite a while before another such situation presented itself. "What do you feel like doing?" Ramesh asked her. "Nothing," she replied. One no longer knows whether she meant it, whether she had already given the go-ahead to Dinesh and Inder to begin lobbying or not, because what the truth was will forever remain a mystery. But at that moment in time, we believed her implicitly. Ramesh wanted her to sit quiet, make no move whatsoever, either towards power or towards any other individual in the cabinet who might be a possible successor to Shastri. No obvious bids, no activity, just sit at home and let the scene unfold. So she sat at home, waiting. There were just a handful of newspapermen snooping around on the lawns when Ramesh left to come home. And fortunately, by the time Subhash Chakravarti of the Times of India dropped by, I could honestly tell him that Ramesh was upstairs sleeping. Kamaraj was then the president of the Congress party, a leader from Tamil Nadu, large, expansive, dark in skin, looking somewhat like a walrus, and a man of few words, which is what distinguished him from the normal run of politicians. No one, of course, ever bothered to ask why he was a man of few words. He really spoke only Tamil and had a considerable following in the south. Anyways, he came to Delhi as a kingmaker, which in itself seems like an action a million light years away from present practice, where power has been congealed in a single hand. He sat with the Congress Working Committee, and together they discussed hour by long hour, while the nation held its breath, standing in the wings as it were. So-and-so wasn't acceptable to so-and-so, and so-and-so wasn't acceptable to so-and-so. Looking back, this very fact proved that there were men in government and party who were close to each other in status and power. Indira retained her distance from the battle, sat at home, watching the crowds outside on her lawns, growing by the hour, Every morning she would ring Ramesh. Come and have breakfast. The marmalade is good, and the crowd is more than yesterday, she would say with credulous disbelief. Very quickly, Ramesh understood the signs. She's in, he announced after returning from a house one morning. It can't be, I said. This country and its men accept a woman prime minister? Never, no matter whose daughter and why. I was so convinced of the predatory nature of the Indian male, rather the burden of inferiority that he carried on his shoulders, that I just could not see him taking orders from a woman. Yet, I must admit, it was a delicious thought, the possibility almost blinding in its future prospects. Could we be so lucky, I wondered? First, Gandhiji giving back an essential dignity, then Nehru with his flights of fancy towards a tangible future, and now, after a brief gap, Indira, young, 47 then, belonging to our age in thought, someone you didn't have to start on the ground floor with. She understood what he was saying even though she might not have the equipment to think it out herself. Any thought of dynasty hadn't yet invaded our fears, and because of Shastri's brief interlude, the line was not as clear as it should have been to us then. We knew she had been elected as a compromise candidate, as someone who was not considered important enough to be a threat to any of the leaders. So the question of her coming in as father's daughter didn't arise in our minds, though I have a nagging feeling which pulls at my conscience and says that somewhere deep, deep down, we didn't want to face it because the present was too blissful, with endless vistas opening up before this blighted country of ours. It was like the possible fulfillment of a wild, wild dream, a dream turning into instant reality. The day she was elected leader sent me into a kind of delirium. Ramesh's sister, Romila, had come over to the house, and though she was not politically involved with Indira in any way, her historical and feminist self had been sufficiently aroused to join me in demolishing a whole bottle of plum brandy, much to Ramesh's discomfiture. Just then, Mohit Sen, Communist Party and all that, dropped in and was somewhat perplexed by our state of frenzied intoxication. Ramesh, fearing that it would be all over town in a day, tried desperately to retrieve the situation, instinctively assuming the garb of protector, of how close he really was, trying to deflate our euphoria by numerous ifs and buts. It was hopeless. I tried in a feeble way to put forward the women's angle when the telephone rang, and it was Dange for Mohit, and I just could not refrain from imparting my mood to him. The things we can do now, I said. Yes, the things we could have done. We certainly tried though, long and hard as it happened. I remember the night before she had to make her speech as leader of the parliamentary party. We had just finished dinner when she sent for Ramesh. There she was, looking somewhat troubled, which always makes her appear suddenly fragile and defenseless, surrounded by Pitambar, Ashok Mehta and C. Subramaniam, all in deep confabulation. She was holding a sheet of paper in her hand. "This is what they want me to say tomorrow," she said, turning to Ramesh. He took it from her, read it, alarmed at the uncontrolled praise of Shastri that it contained. "Is this what you want to say?" he asked. No, you know I don't believe any of it." "Then don't start your career with lies," said Ramesh as he put a line through it, convinced that she would do much better expressing what she felt at that time. No way would she attack Shastri, a man who had died after a period of great strain, working in whatever way for his country. In fact, she would be moved by his tragic end in faraway Tashkent, trying to keep the peace. We may have been babes in the woods then, not knowing the motives of politicians, but she spoke from the heart the next day and was impressive. Once installed as Prime Minister, she was keen on a reshuffle, like a first assertion of independence. Ramesh and Inder went into action and spent 2 days locked up in our cottage, with lists of ministerial candidates spread on our dining table, all very hush-hush, their faces getting more and more impassive by the hour, with the weight of the history they were tampering with, forging, making, initiating. I don't know which. I do know that they handed over their recommendations, after which there was a kind of ominous lull in the scene. Indira seemed to be maintaining a distant silence, almost as if shaking off her supporters or just escaping from her dependence on them. Perhaps she just had too many problems on her plate, too many people to meet, and anyways, it had just been a few days, a week maybe. Inder came over one evening and said, "What do you think has happened? Not even a telephone call?" For the prospective politician, the silent telephone becomes like a raging earache. You can hear no other sound as you wait, because you're waiting for your future. Dinesh was appointed Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, a gentle push up the stairs from his deputy ministership. And I can't recall any of the others except for Jagjeevan Ram, who to us then represented the big black wolf. That attitude was to pass through many permutations over the years, but stories about his corruption were legion, about the bag of diamonds he kept tucked away in the wall behind his bed, his demand for conjugal rights from his daughter-in-law, all of which were ignored because of his birth as a Harijan, which made him the envied repository of their votes. With all these constant happenings, our life became restricted, confined to either those who were involved like us or those who were totally outside the periphery of all of this. Since Pitambar belonged to the first category and he was not in the game of politics, but dreaming like us about the future we would make, we saw a great deal of each other. One evening, we saw his khadi-clad figure coming across the lawn, stopped by the front door, gasping for mental breath, as it were. "We have agreed to devaluation," he said. "It will be announced on the news at 10 tonight. I just came to prepare you for it. Or rather, I was asked to prepare you for it." And then he explained, the World Bank had been asking us to devalue the currency. Devaluation was an admission of some kind of defeat. We were later to be told that 3 of the men involved in the decision had already negotiated jobs with the bank. Anyway, it was done. It was over. At an urgent meeting at Indira's, when Ashok Mehta was asked whether he had the follow-ups ready, he assured Indira that all the articles for the press were being prepared. She nearly hit the ceiling, knowing that there would be much criticism from the left, and unless inflation was checked, she was in for some rough going. On such occasions, the response was always a shuffling silence, and Ashok Mehta was the world's greatest shuffler. So nothing emerged from him. That silence cost him his place with her, eventually. When she sent for Ramesh at her office to continue the devaluation dialogue, he suggested that government set up a continental price control mechanism. Put up a chain of stores which will guarantee the basic necessities at a fixed price. She was visibly excited, and in a matter of a few weeks, the first prototype super bazaar went up in Delhi. Sri Chand Chabda, dynamic head of the New Delhi Municipal Committee, located an empty building in Shankar Market, right in the heart of the city, and made it available almost instantly. Lakshmi Jain was Ramesh's suggestion for the man to set it up, but she was hesitant to begin with, suspicious of his political pretensions. But Ramesh convinced her that his experience was of immense value. He was a doer. Had he not set up the cottage industries emporium, proving himself a pioneer? And so this Peter Lorre character, with his marble eyes, round and always incredulous, was put into position. I didn't see much of her except for the occasional dinners, either at her home or at the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the latter affording me endless amusement. When the very first invitation arrived from the president, it was really because of Indira, and Ramesh felt that one could never refuse the Rashtrapati, come what may. It was formal dress, so we took out his dinner jacket from the mothballs, and I managed to squeeze him into the kamarband with much pulling and tugging. We arrived at the mansion, and it was a mixed or rather jostling metaphor scene all the way, climbing those imperial steps with bodyguards standing by, dressed in their elaborate turbans and red and gold ensembles, reaching that nondescript hall with people milling about, those new to the scene looking a little uncomfortable and awkward, yet pleased that they had finally arrived at this summit point in their lives, and those who were habitual invitees, rather smug and aloof. I remember the time Krishna Menon arrived in his dinner jacket, stick in hand. As we were talking, the ADCs suddenly began to herd us into a circle, and I thought for a brief second that we might be preparing to sink. Someone said, "Husbands and wives together, please," and I quickly took my place next to Ramesh. This was for introduction purposes. The Prime Minister appeared at the top of the steps with the chief guest. On this occasion, it was the UN Secretary General, short and shuffly, exactly like the image of the Southeast Asian in a Hollywood movie. He was presented to each guest. We shook hands. There was an uncomfortable hush, a disjointed feeling as if no one knew exactly what to do. Shortly thereafter, we were led into the dining room where a band struck up. There was a long, narrow table, and since we held no official positions, we were seated right at the end. Behind each chair stood a liveried bearer, but that never prevented the soup appearing in a lukewarm, dishwashy state. The food was very indifferent, and the dinner would almost invariably be followed by a command performance. We would have to adjourn to a small theatre-like room, and Yamini Krishnamurthy would begin her rather stomping dance, On this occasion, the UN Secretary General made a speech on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Indira followed with a reply in Hindi, which was such a torturous translation that she stumbled over practically every word. Each guest had been supplied with the text in both languages, and even Atal Vajpayee was seen reading the English version. The toast was always drunk with a kind of fruit mix, which I invariably drank before the appointed moment and would be stranded with an empty glass. The national anthem would be played, and we would all rise and then follow the leaders. As Ramesh passed by Indira, he could not resist mumbling, "And who do you think understood even one word of what you said?" I remember her raised eyebrow. Looking back on it now, she must surely have found his critical remarks difficult to take, but she never let on then. Over the years, there were many banquets at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. The time the Shah of Iran was being entertained, I had his public relations officer sitting next to me at the table. One always had to make small conversation. Something like this it went. "I have never been to Tehran," I said. "What is it like?" Stupid question, but the reply was delicious. "Oh, Tehran is very advanced. We have several nightclubs and cabarets." Yes, now advance was beginning to be identified with the worst of industrial civilization in the whole of the third world. When Nixon came, he was sweating throughout the evening, great big drops falling from his forehead. The man sitting next to me read the menu eagerly. All those exotic names. "Thank God we're not being served with roast beef," he said, "because that is what the king of Thailand gave us at his banquet, roast beef and boiled potatoes." The woman opposite was asking the member of parliament next to her what was in the sweet dishes. The MP went into a long explanation about how the sweets were a very special Indian preparation made out of pistachios, until I had to interrupt and tell her that they were ordinary, honest-to-God Western marzipans. I would always squirm at the hors d'oeuvres, tinned baked beans on indifferent white bread, and the most kitschy table mats. Somehow nothing went with anything else. It was neither Western nor Indian. It had no distinctive style of any variety. I realized that we would have to evolve a style someday, because we could not go back to the sitting on the ground with Gotakia syndrome, and we would never be able to absorb the Western tradition because it was too alien. And with this, my friends, we come to the end of this episode of the Indologia podcast. I hope you guys liked it. This provides us a great insight into the mind of a Latvian's elite, a member of the inner circle, and how they think. And I'm not going to say anything. You be your own judge. What did you think of this person? What do you think these people are like? What kind of motives do these people have? Send me your messages, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. I'm very curious to know. If you like this podcast, then give me a 5-star rating on Spotify, on Apple, Amazon, wherever you're listening to this podcast on. And please follow me on social media as well. The name is Indologia, Indologia, on Twitter, Instagram. I have a YouTube as well. And you can also join my WhatsApp and Telegram channels. I'll be back next week with another excerpt from another interesting book. So till the next time I see you, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.